Thank you, Rob. Can you all hear me? Sound okay? Thanks. So first of all, it's a privilege to be in this panel with Naya and Carrie, and I certainly want to thank Alvin and Gunther and Melissa for including me in this stimulating and simultaneously deeply disturbing conversation about anti-Semitism in America today. When my paper, Through Women's Eyes, Anti-Semitism in America, was assigned to this panel on new developments in educational theory, I was surprised. After all, the inclusion of gender as a primary category of scholarly analysis is now more than a half-century old. Considering women's lives, experiences, and insights, and expanding out to constructions of gender are certainly not new interventions in educational theory. Moreover, there is an intimate linkage between anti-Semitism and the launching of the second wave feminism of the 1960s and of women's history into academe as one of its many projects. In my field of women's history, Gerda Lerner stands as a towering pioneer. In her 40s, she earned a PhD at Columbia University for a dissertation about a pair of sisters whose campaigns against slavery in the antebellum South subverted prescriptions for women's propriety. But in her late teens as Gerda Kronstein, she had fled Vienna after the Nazis imprisoned her and her mother following the Anschluss. Later, known by her married name of Gerda Lerner, she would describe her turn to women's history as coming out of her life, not out of her head. Meanwhile, Betty Friedan, whose 1963 book, The Feminine Mystique, ignited the spark that flamed into a revolution, credited the anti-Semitism that she had faced as a Jew growing up in Peoria, Illinois, to her discovery of the oppression women faced in a male-dominated society. By the way, she mentioned that anti-Semitism so often that it appeared in her New York Times obituary. Now I, a scholar of Jewish women's history and feminism, find myself joining this conversation about new developments in educational theory. My remarks are informed not only by my own writing on the history of American anti-Semitism, but also by my recent experiences teaching the freshman seminar, Anti-Semitism Enduring Hatred, where, by the way, I want to let Dave Rich know that my students had a heated discussion about Wiley's anti-Semitism and its repercussions. I've decided to think about educational theories through women's eyes broadly, but also through my own eyes, and to use my allotted time to call for 3 interventions in our teaching and scholarship on anti-Semitism. First, I want to insert into our teaching the long history of American anti-Semitism. Then, circling back to my original intent for this paper, I will ask what might we learn when we study anti-Semitism with a gendered lens. Finally, my third intervention suggests incorporating emotional histories into our teaching, research, and writing on anti-Semitism. Let me expand on each of my challenges and ask how these perspectives illuminate the anti-Semitism of our day. First, why is presenting the long view on anti-Semitism in the American past crucial to this moment? I noticed that when Julie Rose interviewed our convener, Alvin Rosenfeld, on her Top of Mind radio show a few weeks ago, that she asked first, was there really an upsurge in anti-Semitic incidents, or were more people simply reporting them now? Professor Rosenfeld responded that yes, there was certainly a contemporary upsurge, but that we needed to put it into the context of America's long history of anti-Semitism. Scholars, of course, know this context, but presumably so few outside the academy do that Julie Rose subsequently invited me to join her to discuss it. In 2020, the Pew Research Center reported the astonishing figure that 84% of American adults could identify the Holocaust, explaining in their own words that it referred to the death and persecution of the Jews by the Nazis. Fewer knew how many Jews were killed or how Adolf Hitler came to power, but it's possible to say that knowledge of the Holocaust has entered Americans' cultural memory. But when it comes to their own history, Americans are abysmally ignorant. In 2019, when the Woodrow Wilson Foundation surveyed 41,000 Americans, it found that a quarter did not know that the First Amendment guarantees freedom of speech. 57% had no idea that Woodrow Wilson was president during World War I. By the way, their other choices were Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Herbert Hoover, and Abraham Lincoln. Given such ignorance of the American past, how can we possibly expect our neighbors to know anything about anti-Semitism at home? In their eyes, and in the many classrooms in U.S. colleges, universities, and schools where the subject of Jew hatred appears, and here I'm thinking of Naya's remarks, anti-Semitism equals the Holocaust. But that is something that happened over there in the old country in Europe. America, so the story goes, is exceptional. A decade ago, the historian Tony Michaels challenged that view, asking, when it comes to anti-Semitism, is America really different? If our standard is state-sponsored genocide and violent pogroms, then of course we answer that America is different. But if our gaze turns to the long history of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism that across the millennia restricted Jews' opportunities, violated their rights, and saw violence perpetrated by neighbors, then the answer is a resounding no. The ideological bases of American anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism are the same as those of Christian Europe. After 23 Jews landed in New Amsterdam in 1654, the colony's governor, Peter Stuyvesant, wanted to expel, and I quote, this deceitful race, such hateful enemies and blasphemers of the name of Christ. Writing the Dutch West India Company, which controlled the colony from the motherland, he repeated classic canards about Jewish customary usury and deceitful trading with the Christians, asserted their repugnance to the magistrates, and echoing medieval ideas that Jews carrying contagion were bent on destroying Christian civilization, petitioned that they be not allowed further to infect and trouble this new colony. The nation's Christian roots planted anti-Judaism in American soil. A teacher could say to her best pupil placed at the end of the class, in the days when a child's performance determined where she sat, I am sorry for you. It is your misfortune, not your fault, that you are a Jew. During the Civil War, some saw the crisis as proof of the divine's anger at the nation's failure to establish Almighty God as the source of all authority and power in civil government. Their calls for a Christian amendment to the Constitution, which would also add the words, the Lord Jesus Christ as the ruler among the nation, continue to find champions well into the 20th century. While last week, Armin Langer discussed the blood libel trope of QAnon, we need to remember that this canard reared its ugly head in Messina, New York in 1928, when, on the Saturday before the eve of Yom Kippur, a little girl disappeared. That, on Sunday afternoon, she walked out of the woods where she had gotten lost the evening before and fallen asleep, did not prevent the town's rabbi, who had been questioned earlier that day by the police about the ritual murder accusations, did not prevent him from wading through a menacing crowd of hundreds massed outside the synagogue as the holiday approached. Last week, Amy Alman asked, what is unique about Christian anti-Judaism in America? I do think there are important distinctions between the American version and the European versions, and would be happy to discuss those during the Q&A. As racial anti-Semitism burst forth in Europe in the 1870s, it coincided with the flowering in the US after the Civil War of what historian Leonard Dinerstein called a full-fledged anti-Semitic society. An earlier generation of historians called its exclusions of Jews from hotels, boarding houses, social clubs, and private schools social anti-Semitism. But recently, historian and lawyer Britt Tevis has argued that these were not acts of social anti-Semitism, but rather unlawful infringements of Jews' civil rights. In the years ahead, these violations would constrict American Jews' opportunities further as colleges and universities fixed quotas on the numbers of Jews admitted, and land deeds restrictive covenants prohibited sale to, and I quote, any person of the Semitic race, including Armenians, Jews, Hebrews, Persians, and Syrians. How many Armenians, Persians, and Syrians were living in Washington, D.C., where this particular covenant was enforced in a neighborhood in the 1940s is unknown. But when Katharine Graham, the future publisher of the Washington Post, tried to buy a home there, she was turned away. Her father, Eugene Mayer, had been born a Jew. She had been baptized. It didn't matter. In 1924, the U.S. Congress set quotas to limit future immigration. In preferring Anglo-Saxons from the British Isles to Jews coming from Eastern Europe, it ensconced into American law racial ideology. By the way, the Act's sponsors, Washington State's Congressman Albert Johnson and Pennsylvania's Senator David Reed, were both members of the Ku Klux Klan. Revived in the 1920s, the Second KKK, stronger in the North than in the South, targeted Catholics and Jews as well as African Americans, and continued to burn towering crosses. Meanwhile, by the time the Johnson-Reed Act became law, Henry Ford was publishing in his newspaper the conspiracy theories underlying the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and requiring every Ford motor dealer in the country to sell it. What does all this mean for us today? History matters. As Daniel Orelowitz told us last week, history is written by whoever has access to an account. Another way of framing that is whoever controls the past owns the present. I need not remind this gathering that every one of the anti-Semitic tropes bandied about today has historical antecedents. History explicates the anti-Semitism behind It's All About the Benjamins baby. It explains the outcry that followed the New York Times revelation that on novelist Alice Walker's stack of books she planned to read was David Ickes' And the Truth Will Set You Free, a summary of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And this context also reminds us why those upholding the separation of church and state raised an alarm after a North Carolina Navy chaplain concluded this year's Easter sermon by telling Jews, Jesus lived, you killed him, God raised him, we saw him, say sorry. I have argued for many years that centering American memory on the Holocaust in our classrooms, as is required in some 20 states, and in museums and memorials that occupy space on our National Mall and in smaller cities like Newport News, Virginia, lets Americans off the hook. We scholars speak of collective memory. In his new book, Cultural Disjunctions, Paul Mendes-Flohr prefers the term cultural memory, which he sees as more dynamic and nuanced, a way of understanding how our memories are rooted in multiple sources. Whichever term we prefer, the knowledge transformed into such memories is essential to understanding where the contemporary rise of anti-Semitism sits within the American experience. By way of comparison, look at the innumerable recent efforts to dismantle the statues of the Confederacy and their celebratory evocation of the lost cause, and replace them with markers remembering and honoring the experiences of the enslaved. Those engaged in these projects understand fully the power of cultural memory, how it shapes our present. The memory of anti-Semitism in American history needs to find its own place in our national narrative. Ignorance of this history has enabled our colleagues engaged in anti-racist work to ignore our requests for partnerships to include fighting anti-Semitism in their worthy endeavors. To give but one personal example, when my colleague Michael Brenner and I organized the 7-part virtual series, Anti-Semitism Since the Holocaust, America, Israel, and Europe at American University last year, and which you may view on our website, our university's Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center declined to co-sponsor the program. I expect that this is not an isolated example. My second intervention asks what happens when we add gender to the study of American anti-Semitism. Let me remind my colleagues that when calls to include writing about gender and the Holocaust emerged in the 1980s, they were highly contested. Writing just a year ago in Did Gender Matter During the Holocaust, the historian Marian Kaplan pointed out yet again that without women's memories, we missed half the history of the Holocaust. Her path-breaking scholarship and that of other scholars homes in on women's narrower picture of everyday contacts under Nazism, their experiences of sexual violence, their roles in the resistance, and much more. But when it comes to the study of American anti-Semitism, historians have paid scant attention to the convergence of gender and anti-Semitism, with the very important exceptions of troubling representations and stereotypes. Hence, I ask what happens when we view anti-Semitism through women's eyes? When, where, and how did America's Jewish women encounter this hate, bigotry, and discrimination? How did they respond as individuals and collectives? Did anti-Semitism change the course of their lives? Finally, how will inserting women and gender as categories of analysis affect the future writing of the history of American anti-Semitism? When I was writing my recent book, America's Jewish Women, A History from Colonial Times to Today, Jewish women's experiences with anti-Semitism came up episodically. At an international women's suffrage meeting in 1920, the consumer activist Maud Nathan heard a delegate blame Jewish profiteering for post-war suffering. When, at a dinner party in the 1930s, the host turned the conversation to money-grubbing Jews controlling the world, and all those at the table enthusiastically chimed in, one dinner guest, the Pulitzer Prize-winning writer Edna Ferber, bravely announced that she was a Jew. After World War II, when Bess Meyerson was crowned Miss America, she saw sponsors walk away from promotional contracts rather than have a Jewish woman represent them. Most of us here have likely read the recent books on anti-Semitism by Deborah Lipstadt and Barry Weiss. Amy Ellman's paper last week discussed Weiss's book. We know that Jewish women stand up against anti-Semitism today, but I expect that many here do not know that Lipstadt and Weiss have taken their places in a long line of American Jewish women who, having met anti-Semitism, responded with their pens. In the 19th century, they included Rachel Mordecai and Rebecca Gratz, who protested anti-Jewish canards privately in letters, and Ernestine Potowsky-Rose, Nina Marias, and Emma Lazarus, who called out anti-Semitism in public. In fact, it is striking that in the 1880s, both Nina Marias and Emma Lazarus, who had no claim to communal authority other than their words, published important articles on anti-Semitism in leading American magazines. I surveyed 4 such magazines across the 1880s and found no comparable article written by a man. How Nina Marias, for example, came to write Jewish Ostracism in America, the North American Review's only full-fledged expose on anti-Semitism in the 1880s, is not known. As a woman and a Jew, she would have represented a double outsider to the audience of this journal. I wonder whether the editor considered criticism of Christian America less objectionable coming from a female, or perhaps her display of her own bruised feelings over this prejudice, for she is the one who wrote about the teacher's remark to her best pupil, was deemed more acceptable coming from a woman. I don't have answers, but these are questions that require further exploration. Furthermore, research suggests another potential gendered response to anti-Semitism comes from the positioning of women within their families. Jewish women have left records of encountering anti-Semitism up close and personal, and especially through their children. In 21st century New York, a mother covers her son's yarmulke with a hat. whenever he goes out. Nevertheless, one Sabbath eve, the child and his father are followed down the street by a man screaming, "You Jews." As the boy's mother puts her 4-year-old to bed that evening, he cries that he doesn't want to go to shul the next day. Another mother, dropping her 2-year-old off at his Brooklyn preschool, pushes aside a curtain placed over the door. It covers a swastika that had appeared overnight. That mother, Dana Sussman, New York City's Deputy Commissioner on Human Rights, reflected, although anti-Semitism takes different forms, it affects all of us. Writing recently of these painful contemporary encounters with anti-Semitism, these Jewish mothers join another lineup of America's Jewish mothers who experience the pain of anti-Semitism through their children. A century ago, one of them wrote of the insults, innuendos, and slander directed at her faith during her son's recent trial. Its purpose, Mrs. Ray Frank told the Washington Post, was to poison and destroy. Not long after, her son, Leo Frank, the Atlanta pencil factory manager wrongfully convicted of murder, was lynched by a mob of upstanding Marietta Christians, no matter what, as Stephen Norwood told us last week, the Nation of Islam likes to claim. The trope of Jewish women's personal encounters with anti-Semitism, coming through their children and also through extended family, friends, neighbors, and even local shopkeepers, sheds light on the gendered nature of anti-Semitism in the American past and present. Just as uncovering facets of women's experiences in the Holocaust has added enormously to our understanding of that history, so too I predict will interjecting gender into our examination of American anti-Semitism, past and present, advance our understanding and offer us new insights for responding to the problem. Let me add that I have recently begun this work in a lecture, a published lecture that just appeared called "It Can Happen Here: Anti-Semitism, Gender, and the American Past." It was published by the University of Michigan's David W. Bellin Lectures in American Jewish Affairs. Finally, I turn to my third intervention, introducing the history of emotions into the study of anti-Semitism. Here again, I nod to Marian Kaplan, who has pointed to how the history of emotions suggests new avenues for studying the Holocaust. It propels us to ask questions about how victims, male and female, felt about their daily lives, to see if reactions and memories differ by gender, and to study if these change over time and conform to the feeling rules, a concept established in the field. That her latest book, Hitler's Jewish Refugees, is subtitled Hope and Anxiety in Portugal, demonstrates the potential of emotional histories. For more than 3 decades, scholars have produced a rich literature on the emotional turn in history. They have demonstrated that intense feelings flare in moments of crisis. They evoke emotions, anger, hatred, fear, despair, that shape how people apprehend their world and which have the potential to propel action. Moreover, memories of emotions like collective victimization coalesce groups into what these scholars call emotional communities. Even before reading Kaplan's work, I had begun thinking about the connections between emotional histories and anti-Semitism because of the range of emotions voiced by the women who had up close and personal encounters with anti-Semitism, and that had sparked my interest. Their letters, their articles conveyed disappointment, indignation, exasperation, injury, fear, and despair. And so at first I wasn't surprised, thinking that, well, after all, emotions are quintessentially feminine, as a group of 6 leading scholars in this field noted in a major article in the American Historical Review. But of course, emotions are not quintessentially feminine, and records of emotional histories span the gender divide. To give but one example, Ben Hecht, journalist, novelist, Academy Award-winning writer of Scarface, script fixer for Gone with the Wind, and Irgun supporter, liked to say that he became a Jew in 1939. Of course, he had been born a Jew, but the Nazi persecution of the Jews compelled him to see the world through Jewish eyes. In the spring of 1943, he wrote the script for a pageant staged around the country to mourn the millions of Jews murdered in Europe and compel American action to save the remaining. When the pageant, We Will Never Die, was performed in the nation's capital, his anger blazed forth. Hecht indicted the 7 Supreme Court justices, 38 senators, 218 congressmen, and First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt sitting in his audience. He wrote, "As much by the silence of the world as by the howl of the posse has the Jew been condemned. The silence of our history makers has made them honorary members of the German posse." Then, since pageants were ephemeral in the years before YouTube, he followed up with his book, A Guide for the Bedeviled, where he also pointed to the anti-Semitism that he saw everywhere on this side of the Atlantic. Published in 1944, his book hit the bestseller list. More than half a century later, the dentist Perry Brickman went to see an exhibit, Jews at Emory, Faces of a Changing Nation. Encountering there a reproduction of a graph published in 1962 by the Anti-Defamation League changed his life. It showed that 65% of the Jewish students, compared to 15% of the Gentile students, studying at Emory's dental school between 1948 and 1958 had either been flunked out or compelled to repeat a year or more of their classes. Brickman and his 3 Jewish friends had entered Emory's dental school together. All had been told to leave. They spent decades in a fraternity of silence. Stunned to learn that they were not alone, Brickman launched a crusade. He found dozens of men with similar stories of grief and disappointment. 6 years later, Emory welcomed them back to campus, and the university's president issued a public apology. Do emotional histories hold out promise for studying American anti-Semitism in the past and the present? If we think about how anti-Semitism has constructed Jews into an emotional community across time, then emotional histories indeed hold out promise for our research on anti-Semitism and for prompting action. We need research that illuminates patterns in emotional responses to anti-Semitism. They will shed light on the social organization of American Jewry and its relationship to its neighbors. I've been struck during this conference that most of the papers focus on the anti-Semites, their thoughts, their feelings, and not on their targets. But thinking of our contemporary moment and the overall theme of this conference, we must ask if harnessing the emotions caused by experiencing and responding to anti-Semitism will lend power to a social movement to combat it. I submit, in conclusion, that teaching the long history of American anti-Semitism and adding the lenses of gender history and emotional history to our studies must occupy us now and into the future if we are to respond to the consequences of anti-Semitism rising all around us. Thank you.